Okay, good morning, everyone. I think we're going to get started. So my name is Michael Bailey. I am the interim dean here at the McCourt School of Public Policy, so welcome. So the McCourt School, we have a very broad mission, which is to make policy better, to make it more effective, more efficient, to help people lead more fulfilling lives. And so we try to achieve that mission with 3 pillars. And so one pillar is the research that our faculty does, and you'll hear more about that today. Another pillar is our training students. And so we have programs in public policy, we have programs in international development and data science and leadership, executive leadership, and so forth. And so that's trying to give folks the tools to be more effective once they're in the policy world. The third pillar of us trying to achieve our mission is to try to really engage with important questions, right? And engage, be a hub of dialogue. And so in order to pursue that or advance that goal, 6 years ago we created this LEAD conference series. And so LEAD is an acronym, which I always have trouble remembering, but it is an acronym for Leadership, Evidence, Analysis, and Debate. And so those are the pillars of engaging, deeply engaging with interesting topics. And so the goal is to bring together really interesting, smart people who are thinking about important issues, doing things related to important issues, bring them together, have a conversation, see what we can learn, and see what we can take away from that. And so today we're having a discussion, as you know, about trust. And so I think every one of us has the experience where you wake up in the morning and you look at your phone or your newspaper, or whatever you're getting your news from, and you're like, man, these folks, they're not. Are they really on my team, right? Do they know what they're doing? Do they have my best interests at heart? And the thing is that's like everybody's doing that wherever you're kind of starting from, right? It's, like I'm doing that for sure, but like people who have very different views from me, in this we share at least one part of our morning is to be, something in the pit of our stomach feels a little bit uneasy. And so that issue, that feeling, that's one of the things that people who think a lot about democracy and the functioning of a democracy think a lot about, right? Is do we need this extra element? Is it just the institutions that we have? Is it just the laws that we have, the electoral systems that we have? Or is there something deeper and broader about how we relate to our fellow citizens? And that encompasses a lot, but certainly that encompasses trust. So I'm really excited to bring together this really fabulous set of people who've been thinking about these issues and not just thinking about them, but like getting data and really digging deep on this, right? So we can really do more than just kind of have our initial take on what might be happening with regard to these issues. So before we get started, I do want to just set up a couple things. I want to thank John Ladd and Josh Tucker, wherever Josh is, he's here. There he is, for doing the Baker poll and for really doing a lot of leadership on this. I also want to thank the Knight Foundation and our Baker Center for Leadership and Governance for all their help in supporting this and setting this up as well. I also want to thank our keynote speaker, Michael Dimmick, the president of Pew Research Center, he'll be doing the keynote later today. And then one piece of logistics is that feel free to have your phone out and ready. We're going to be doing some live polling. And also, if you are in a tweeting mood, our tag is at McCourt School, and our hashtag is GULead 2018. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, John Ladd, who will tell you a little bit more about the Baker poll and about the conference today. So, John.
All right, thanks, Mike. I'm excited to get going, but very first thing, I'd like to get you involved first thing in the day today. So you have on your tables in front of you paper that looks like this, and if you pull out your phones and browse to menti.com, I know you have them. You're pretending you don't have your phones, like, oh, I don't bring phones to events, but I know you have your phones. Please turn off the audio, but please do take them out. If you go to menti.com and enter, there's a code here, which is on the slip, 816758. 816758. All right. If you enter 816758, you should go. I would like you to answer one question. If I could put the question up here. All right, the question I'd like to start off with today is, in which country did its citizens report the highest rate of trust in their national government to do what's right? Right? So we asked everybody, in different countries, and this is Pew data. This is Pew data for this. So I'd like you to guess, right? And we'll set 1 minute on the clock here to guess what the answer is for this. Which of these countries? And the options we've given you is France, United States, Japan, and South Africa. Okay. Let's see here. We got so we got a minute here. We got more people weighing in. More people weighing in. Because it's not obvious. We focus mostly on the United States, but it's not obvious what the answer is or would be here. So let's see what people. Can we see what people are saying? Oh, okay. Oh, wow. This is a great audience. I am impressed with the audience here today, because that answer is right. So Japan. This is what we were hoping for. I wasn't hoping to fool you. I was hoping to get it right. So I was hoping you got it right. So you are correct. We've gathered the right. I already know we've gathered the right experts here today. First question, you're on it. All right. So in Japan, 57% trust the national government to do what's right. Recent poll said, and followed by the United States, South Africa, and France. All right, so I want to do one more. This focused just on the United States, so it's going to be still on your phone. It's going to be still on your phone, and this is domestically focused. And the question is, which group of leaders retain the highest level of confidence among Americans to act in the best interest of the public? And it's business leaders, K through 12 principals and superintendents, religious leaders, and scientists, or scientists. All right, so you have to think about it. Think if you can predict what this 2016 poll data found. This is obviously just a small sample of the things that so many people ask questions about this, and we've been studying this so much, but it's so important, and there's still so much to learn. This is also Pew data. All right, let's put up the results here. So this is people. What we got? This is ours. Okay, yeah. So religious leaders is predicted. That's not bad. So not as good as the first question. I honestly got to say, not as good as the first question, but still pretty good. So the right answer, what the American public actually gives of the most confidence in is scientists. The actual answer is 21% of people have a great deal of confidence in scientists, 13 in social leaders, 13 in religious leaders, and 3% have a great deal of confidence in business leaders. All right, last one. This is not a quiz anymore, so you can relax. The first one you knocked it out of the park. The second one was pretty good. But there's no right answer to this. Well, there's one I hope, but we're not guessing the American public anymore. This is your opinion. So I just want to get in this room, how satisfied are you with how democracy is working in the United States? All right? Just people in this room. I realize this is what pollsters would call not a representative sample, or I guess what survey researchers would call an opt-in sample these days. This is definitely here an opt-in sample. But let's see your opinion. And as I'm doing a poll, I'm obligated to say your answer will be anonymous. Your data will be protected. You will not be identified. Okay, we're coming up here. All right, great. So in this room, we're doing okay. I feel so 13% of you are very satisfied, 43% somewhat satisfied, 30% somewhat. Oh, I'm the other way. I'm running the other way. Oh, it's not as good as I thought. I'm very disappointed. All right. Even here, it's not as good as I am concerned. I am already concerned. All right. Very satisfied, 5%, somewhat satisfied, 30%, 43% somewhat so a substantial majority 66% is somewhat dissatisfied or very dissatisfied, even in this room of experts on this topic, this opt-in sample. And maybe that's concerning because expertise doesn't lead you to feel better about the American system, and that is itself substantially worrisome. Okay, well, now I want to bring you to the purpose of today, because here at Georgetown, we brought you here today for an incredibly important conversation on an incredibly important and timely topic. Because America today, as I think you know in one way or another, is facing a crisis, a type of crisis that it's never exactly faced before, right? Daily, as Mike referred to, right? And America throughout its history has been a clash of ideas. People have always been fighting over what America's about, right? And there's a lot of history and a lot of political science research about that, right? But one thing we have throughout American history agreed on is kind of a reverence for the idea of the Constitution as a system, right? In the American system, there's a lot of literature about the 1800s America, how people had this somewhat strange reverence for the system, like the Constitution itself, right? And for specific propositions, right? So we, throughout American history, have had this notion that we always claim to ourselves that the idea we value the most is, to quote Abraham Lincoln, the proposition that all people are created equal, right? And there's a value in claiming that, even though we often fail to live up to that. So that's quite different from rival notions, right? That the nation is about blood and soil, right? Or that the nation is about loyalty to a particular person or particular individual or a particular regime, right? You might notice that when the president and federal officials take a loyalty oath to the Constitution, to a system, right? To a set of laws and principles, right? Not to a particular ethnicity, not to a particular location, but to a system, right? This idea has been helpful, and it's helped, although it certainly has not guaranteed us to incorporate new people who come here and incorporate people whose ancestors have always lived here but have certainly not always been incorporated. The idea that we think about this as a basic principle that we always claim to believe in. The problem is that this idea is under threat right now, and there are a lot of people who, at this time when the American system as a system needs defending, who aren't sure it's worth defending. And often for legitimate reasons, right? Different people have reasons to be dissatisfied with the American system and American institutions. Certainly, racial minority groups have legitimate reasons to think that American institutions have often been against them, not just fail them, but hostile to them. White Americans have legitimate and illegitimate grievances with American institutions, probably at the moment, right? Among the legitimate grievances is probably that the American economic system over the last 40 years hasn't grown incomes for most people, right? Which has affected white Americans and communities of color as well, right? So that's a legitimate reason to feel that the American system has not been delivering. And white Americans probably maybe also have illegitimate grievances in the sense that the demographic breakdown of the United States is changing and becoming less white over time. And also perhaps just the existence of Barack Obama as a president who served 2 terms and by many objective measures, a reasonably successful president, right? Those would be possibly illegitimate grievances, but that also may undermine support for the system itself. So, Lord knows the American system has often failed some or all of its people. Lord knows people have reasons to be upset, and the American system is often hard to defend. sometimes. But it needs defenders right now. It needs defenders right now. I don't know if it's worthy of defenders, but it needs defenders. All right? So a year and a half ago, the Knight Foundation approached Josh Tucker and I, and John Sosky from the Knight Foundation is here today, representing them today, approached Josh Tucker and I and wanted to start a new initiative, which is made up of assessing the quality of American democracy, figuring out the best ways to do that, gather new data to measure the health of American democracy, share that data with other philanthropists, with other researchers, and that is why you're here today, as part of that initiative. Later, after Josh Tucker and I started working with the Knight Foundation, the Baker Center for Leadership in Government joined that partnership to contribute to this ongoing effort to understand American democracy, to see if there are ways we can give people legitimate reasons to have faith on and while improving the American system. So what does that initiative consist of? Right? Well, the biggest thing it consists of is here in the McCourt School, as part of the Baker Center for Leadership and Governance, we're conducting the Baker Poll sponsored by the Knight Foundation. This Baker Poll is going to be measuring both confidence in institutions and measures of faith in democracy and how they interact with each other. It's also going to have a very large sample size and particularly sample not just the general population, but particularly make sure we oversample particularly racial communities, African Americans, Latino communities, and Asian Americans as well. It's also going to have a substantial open-ended component, right? We've been asking a lot of trust institution questions for a long time that are incredibly useful. That's how we know that this is an important topic. But sometimes these questions can be vague, yeah? And we want to know how people think about this in their own terms. So how this is going to be different is a little different from existing surveys. It's going to have a substantial open-ended component, a large sample size, and it's going to ask confidence institutions and faith in democracy questions at once. We also want to, at the same time, we're not just conducting another poll, but we want to have a series of initiatives like this that brings people together. This is the beginning. This is a convening to help pool knowledge and make all our work in this area better. And that's why we brought you here today to talk about this at the beginning of this initiative. And also, we want to share the data we find, just as other amazing researchers in this area, like Pew and others, share their data on their website. We want to build a web presence that so we can share the data and all get better at understanding these issues. So thank you for being here today. This issue we're trying to address today is not really a partisan issue, right? Support for democracy in the United States, support for the American system, in improving the American system, right, is not per se about which party you voted for. It's not about what the top marginal tax rate should be. Exactly. It's not about your opinion about abortion. It's not about how many troops America should have in Afghanistan exactly. Right? It's about whether the character and nature of American institutions can be preserved and improved in a way that makes them continue to be worth preserving. So that's why you're here today. This is a big job, and we want to bring a lot of people together because we're all, in some ways, in this together. And we need your help. I certainly can't do it. But hopefully together we can do it. And we really can't fail. really can't fail. So thank you for being here. So with that, I want to usher up the first panel of the day, which is going to talk about causes of trust in institutions in the United States. Help us better understand the loss of trust. The goal is to help us better understand the loss of trust in institutions. I'd like to usher up the panelists. I'd like to introduce moderating this first panel will be my research partner, Josh Tucker. And I'll just introduce Josh, and then he'll introduce the panelists. Josh is a professor of politics at New York University. He's also director of the Jordan Center for Advanced Study of Russia and co-director of NYU's Social Media and Political Participation Lab. He's also a co-author of the Monkey Cage blog, which is the award-winning political science blog at the Washington Post. And he's also the author of Communism's Shadow, Historical Legacies, and Contemporary Political Attitudes, which investigated support for democracy among people who grew up under communism and now live in post-communism, and tried to understand exactly how what their attitudes toward democracy are, and how these people who've gone through change sorted out whether they really believed in democratic systems or preferred non-democratic systems. So his kind of historical and comparative expertise is really essential for our conversations today. So with that, I'd like to introduce and usher Josh and our other initial panelists up to the stage, please. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks for the very kind introduction. Thanks to all of you for joining us here today. And I also, as well, thanks to Mike Bailey for hosting this event here. I also want to extend my thanks to John Sotsky and the Knight Foundation for their support, and Victoria Canberra and the Baker Center for their support for the research that's going on here. It's absolutely instrumental, and it's been an incredible experience sort of working with different organizations that are interested in pushing this agenda forward. So thank you all very much, and thanks everyone for being here. So it's my great pleasure to introduce the panelists. I'll stand up here and introduce them, and then we're going to sit down and have a conversation. So we are very fortunate to be welcomed here by Shayla Nunnally, who's an associate professor with a joint appointment in political science and Africana Studies Institute at the University of Connecticut. She specializes in public opinion and political behavior and race and politics, African American public opinion. Her current research focuses on the transmission of memory across generations and communities of Black Americans, and what this transmission means for cultural trauma, group remembrance, group politics, and institution building. To her left is Elizabeth Thies-Moore, who is the Willa Cather Professor of Political Science and Associate Dean for Faculty in the Colleges of Arts and Sciences at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Her research focuses on public opinion concerning various aspects of democracy, including support for civil liberties, Congress, democratic process, and the American people as a national group. She's the author of several award-winning books, including Congress as Public Enemy and Stealth Democracy. And then to her left, we're joined by Mark Hetherington, professor at Vanderbilt University. He studies the American electorate with a particular focus on the polarization of public opinion. He's the author of 3 scholarly books, the most recent of which, Why Washington Won't Work, won the Alexander George Award from the International Society of Political Psychology as the best book in the field of political psychology, published in 2015. I want to echo John's remarks. We are extremely grateful for all of the panelists for coming and joining us here today. One of the goals of this project is to be as open and collaborative as possible. As we said, we're going to make the data available to all these wonderful scholars who are here, but even more importantly, it's incredible. I'm so looking forward to today, and so looking forward to this panel in particular, so that I can expand my knowledge of what all these people who've been working in this area have learned from this. So it's a great pleasure to be joined by these people on the stage today. And I'm going to start off with the question. I want to start as a first question, and maybe we'll go in order across the panel. So Shayla, if you want to start by asking the panelists, what do you think is the most important cause of the decline of institutions, the decline of trust in institutions, confidence in institutions that we've seen in the United States? And what I really want to kind of get at here is, first of all, like, what do you think is the main driver that's going on here? But secondly, I want to probe you to push you to think a little bit about whether this is a result of this particular moment that we find ourselves in American history, which I think would be the indication that one would get from most of our interactions with the mass media, most of our daily interactions with this question? Or is this a function of much longer term trends? So sort of what's the most important question that you what is the most important driver, what brought us here today to be talking about decline in trust in institutions? And to what extent is that a longer term trend, or what extent is that a particular function of the moment we find ourselves in today? So Charlotte, you want to start?
So first, I think it's important to just consider the concept of trust, right? So when we speak of trust, we're thinking of people thinking about the outcomes that might best benefit them, but also what that means for determining risks. So people may be uncertain about how outcomes may affect them. But importantly, if I were to think about this as far as a long-term analysis, and maybe within, let's say a 150-year period, quite honestly. Quite honestly, I think that we are witnessing come to fore and being more honest about the extent to which people's political interests are connected to how they see groups receive benefits or not in society. And that also leads me then to suggest that I think we need to consider more closely the extent to, quite honestly, race and politics is a part of American politics and has very much so been integrated in the American political party system since the Civil War. And if we think about that and what that means for even the integration of, for example, one of the long-standing groups in American politics as a racial and ethnic minority group, African Americans in particular, this is where we see that even some of the measures that we have used in order to interrogate and investigate trust may not have considered the extent to which race and politics really are at the core of how people may either implicitly or explicitly consider their political interest. So I really do believe that if we were to consider that as far as the measures that we develop, as well as think about, for example, confidence in institutions and what that means for how people, especially African Americans and other racial and ethnic minority groups, feel as if their interests are being heard, represented, that gives us one lens. But then also, as we are moving into this current climate, we have seen probably since 2008, and especially with the decline in the economy, more conversations that involve how lower income whites also perceive that their stake in the political economy might be questionable. And that might also be juxtaposed with respect to the conditions of racial and ethnic minorities, who, as a part of the political party system, interestingly have been incorporated in ways by political elites that I think suggest that there is a zero-sum game among those groups. And so with that said, I think this points us to a more honest conversation about the extent to which race does influence our politics.
Just to push a little more on that zero-sum conception, would it be legitimate to say that the zero-sum conception is been enhanced by the moment that we're in right now? Or would you say as well the zero-sum conception, this idea that that's actually also something that's been a longer trend coming? Or is that something that you can sort of, the 2016 campaign, for example, exacerbated?
I think it's a longer trend, but I think the expressions of that zero-sum feeling on behalf of whites has become manifested more openly in this particular political climate, other than what we had seen prior to the 1960s. So what that means to, for example, have what Mendelberg refers to as implicit racial appeals versus explicit racial appeals, I think we're back to a moment where explicitly expressing one's views in a way that harkens specific racial and ethnic minority groups in particular are more evident.
Okay, thank you. Elizabeth?
So answering the question of the main cause of the decline in trust is really hard. Okay. So as you know, I think there's a lot that's going on. Obviously, actual real political events have a big impact. Scandals, crises, the economic conditions of a country have a huge impact. But I want to focus in on what I think is a primary cause, and that is that I actually think democracy increases distrust in government. And the reason for that is that the processes of democracy are pretty messy and inefficient. There's research that shows that the more transparent governments are, the less trust people have in those governments. When people see what's happening and they don't like seeing what's going on, I think their trust declines precipitously. So in a sense, the more democratic we see our governments become, and they have become so much more democratic and actually so much less corrupt in Western democracies, trust has declined. And this is not just in the United States, it's in Europe as well. So I don't think when we talk about whether this is a here and now thing, is this just something specific to our time? I don't think it is. I don't think it's specific to the US. I think it is a broader manifestation of how we do our politics. I also think there's been a debate about whether it's policy that's really driving this decline in trust, or whether it's processes, and John Hibbing and I have come down on the side of processes. But I do think that if trust, as Shayla was saying, if trust is about risk and taking a risk, if we're willing to take a risk to trust something like our government, we also have to take into account predictability. And so is that government predictable over time? And then the third thing I think is fairness and neutrality in how authority is imposed on us. And if we look at all of those things, I think that concern about processes really play a major role, because it's going to affect everything. If we can't trust our government, if we aren't willing to take that risk of trusting our government to do what's right, we will question everything. And we see that more and more and more, and the media make us think about that more and more and more, about how we really can't take that risk. And so I think all of that plays a role in what's going on.
So this question about transparency leading to decline in trust is fascinating. And one of the original promises of the e-government movement was that we would get much more transparency what's going on. People would understand what was going on with their governments, and there'd be a closer link between politicians and the citizenry. So in a sense, is it correct to infer from the work that you've been doing that there's a sort of fundamental tension between the sort of new digital technologies? I mean, can we lay part of the blame for the decline in trust in institutions at the sort of digital era in which we find ourselves today?
Well, I think that's true in a lot of ways. So one thing is that with transparency, when people want more information about their government and then they can't get it, they wonder why are they hiding things? What's going on? Why are they hiding what's going on? But I think with the whole idea about e-government, e-democracy, it's also a matter of the media having information, and social media as well, having information available to us at all times. And people who are more knowledgeable about government are not more trusting, right? So I think there's the whole idea of, I'm for openness and transparency, so I'm not saying I'm against it, but I do think there is that tension that it decreases our trust in government.
Okay, thank you very much. Mark?
Well, I think a couple of distinctions are probably important to make here. One of them is, what's the government? Are we talking about institutions more broadly, democracy, and so forth? And the fact of the matter is, I've been studying this for a couple of decades now, and there's really not, until very recently, been a whole lot of concern about the degree to which trust in democracy, the governing arrangements that we have today is particularly low. But the trust in the people who are in charge of the government at any given time has plummeted. So I think this is something that's important to keep in mind, and something I hope to come back to during the course of things, because as it relates to the first thing, support for the institutions of democracy, it's going to turn out, I think, somewhat counterintuitively, that the people who have high levels of trust in government might be the folks who are willing to go along with the biggest transformations, challenges to governing arrangements that we have, bypassing Congress, not worrying so much about civil liberties and so forth. But let me leave that aside for a minute. As it relates to, is this a new moment in time? This notion of low levels of trust in the people running the government, I think it's kind of interesting for us maybe to step back as political scientists and think about when we started to collect data. We started to collect data on the American public right after the Second World War, which is an incredibly anomalous time when trust levels were extraordinarily high in all sorts of different institutions. So again, I don't mean to minimize the idea that low levels of trust in government are not important. In fact, I've spent most of my career suggesting that in fact it is, but it's not anomalous. In fact, probably the time that was anomalous was the time that we started to collect data. So we look back on the 50s and 60s and compare this moment in time with that and think, God, what's happened to us? But instead, what would be an interesting thing is to look back on, say the founding and look at the institutions that the founders came up with, which suggest a high level of distrust in government. That's why they created institutions the way that they did, because they weren't necessarily trustworthy in that sense. Let me just add, though, one thing to the causes and the reason that I think we're in a situation that's going to be difficult to escape as it relates to trust in the institutions, or the people running the institutions at least, which again I think creates a problem for institutional legitimacy, down the road, is polarization. One of the things that didn't used to have any influence, or at least a very small influence, on the amount of trust that people expressed was who was in government. I mean, Democrats trusted the government a little bit when the Democrats were in, a little bit more when the Democrats were in. The Republicans trusted it a little bit more when the Republicans were in. But that is fundamentally different now. It's not uncommon over the last two presidential administrations to find fewer than 10, sometimes fewer than 5% of out-party partisans expressing any trust in the government at all. In fact, in 2010, when Tom Rudolph and I did a survey on this, over 50% of Republicans said they never trusted the government in Washington to do what's right when Barack Obama was president. Never. I mean, they could have said some of the time, but never. My mom told me never to say never. This is a remarkable turn of events. So, and I feel certain, although the data aren't available, I have a feeling Democrats are expressing much the same about Republicans running the government right now. So we find ourselves in a polarized time where the affect is so strong about the other side that you don't trust the other side to do anything, and frankly, maybe with good reason right now. And this is going to be a very difficult pattern to escape.
So just to follow up on the point you mentioned about like headline numbers of trust in democracy, there has been, I would like to point the audience, because this is a bunch of people who are very interested in this question, there's this new study that was just released by the Voter Study Group. There was an op-ed piece in the New York Times a couple days ago, or last week, lead dropman Larry Diamond, pushing back on this idea that the headline numbers of support for democracy, and particularly among millennials, there has been an argument put out there that millennials have declining support in democracy, and the Voter Study Group has actually found completely different findings in this regard. So it's a study that's worth looking at. The op-ed is there. You can take a look at this. But I think it points to the importance of not getting ideas in our head because we hear things once and then thinking that that's the case, but constantly being willing to sort of update our understanding on this particular case. Mark, I did want to just push back on one question, which when we think about this concept of trust, because I was intrigued by your discussion about the difference between trust in institutions per se versus trust in the individuals running those institutions. So one of the things that we're trying to do with this study is the whole reason we're collecting all these open-ended questions is we want to know when people say, do you have trust in Congress, what it is that people are thinking about when they do that. So hopefully we're going to be able to bring some data to the floor to inform us and give us a sense of understanding, at least in this particular moment, what people are thinking about when they answer these trust questions. But as someone who's been studying this for a long time, obviously we can't go back and ask these questions in the past, but how do you think about, when you ask a question like trust in Congress, are you thinking that that's going to give you an institutional answer, or are you thinking that that's going to give you an answer about the individuals who are running Congress, and maybe other questions of this ilk, or do you really, when we ask about like confidence in the Republican Party, are we getting, or confidence in political parties, do you think we're getting at trust in the individuals running the Republican Party right now, or the institution of political parties, just to think about these questions?
Josh, I just think that's just the most important question for us to get our arms around, at this point, because the classic trust in government question: how much do you trust the government in Washington to do what's right? Well, the government in Washington is pretty damn big. What part of it are we talking about, given the circumstances? Are we talking about Congress? Are we talking about the courts? Are we talking about the president? Are we talking about the military? Are we talking about, some executive branch agency? And the work that Tom and I have done, we ask people these questions about specific institutions within Congress, within the government. So, like Health and Human Services, the Department of Defense, even the EPA. They all get higher marks than the government in Washington, which suggests to me that government in Washington is just sort of some term that people don't actually like, or on the other side, they have no idea what Health and Human Services does. Health, I like health. I'm human, and services are good. So with that in mind, we just don't know exactly what people have a sense of. So, and just to push your point even a little bit farther is, we have this absence of trust in government, but we see a specific institution of government like the FBI or the Department of Justice being attacked right now. And what we need to, I think, work really hard to do is develop these sort of baseline understandings of what people think of that specific institution, so we can see what impact this negative rhetoric about it has, and so forth. So. I believe that what you've identified, Josh, is the very most important thing that we have to do going forward.
Well, so actually, we'd be pleased to know we were trying to, go through, a penultimate check on the survey institution and the instrument for the survey, and the FBI is one of the institutions that made the cut, and it's going to it made the cut for getting these open-ended answers. Excellent. Precisely because we think at this particular moment. And so this question too about the government versus the parts of the government, there are real echoes here of when you ask people. I remember looking at public opinion about Obamacare, and you would have people who had very negative opinions of Obamacare, but then if you ask them about every single component of Obamacare, except for the individual mandate, that every single component of Obamacare had strong support among population. So I think this is a bigger question, and maybe a kind of second generation question on public opinion, is this unpacking of when people are just cheerleading on and I think going back to your point on effective polarization, this is crucially important. All right, I want to come back now and give each of the panelists another chance to now that having sort of identified what we think are these sort of big drivers, to follow up on the extent to which we think this varies across subsections of the population. So Shayla, you had started talking about African Americans in particular, but when we think about some of these drivers in trust, what are the most, so building off of, I guess, the answer you gave to the first question, but building off of this, how do we think these questions are varying across subsections of the population? How do we think these are being interpreted, or, do we want to, because it's very easy to fall into a conversation about monolithic declines in trust. But what are the key differentiations across relevant subsections of the population that we need to be thinking about, the ways in which this is playing out differently?
So I do think, thinking about polarization is important. And I say that because in thinking about the party system, I think we're seeing increasingly that groups are falling within the parties along racial lines. So yes, increasingly more whites are becoming Republican, and we've seen a history of racial and ethnic minority groups supporting the Democratic Party. But with that said, that points to the need for disaggregation, making sure that when we speak of Republicans or we speak of Democrats supporting certain aspects of trust or even political institutions, political actors, that we need to make sure that we're disaggregating at a level that we account for intersectional analysis, whether it be, for example, Latinx, Latinas, Black women, for example, to understand what are the nuances within these groupings of partisans. But also, we find that, for example, in more recent public opinion data, and even we'll hear as far as the Pew Research Center, that, for example, whites are expressing more anger in federal government, and that attitudes about federal government actually for racial and ethnic minority groups are more positive than they are for, let's say, state and local government, which we find for whites. So unpacking what that means for how different groups perceive government is important, especially as far as, for example, the political actors, because immediately when you said Obamacare, I thought, my goodness, if you were to ask a survey asking people about Obamacare and explicitly stating Obamacare, we find that there's a racialization of Obamacare and that usage of that term. It becomes associated with the president and him having been the first black president. So what that means for even how we ask our questions becomes pertinent for different subgroups of the population. And even what that means for perhaps even, as Tesla refers to, spillover effects in other public policy areas, we have to be mindful for how groups might react to our measures.
Right. The distinction between, so this is very interesting, the distinction between African Americans and other minority groups having more support for federal government, less for state and local, how much do you think that was a product of the moment of having Barack Obama as president versus a more general, long-lasting trend? Do we even know the answer to that question? Has this been, I mean, maybe Mike will talk about this later today, but is this still continuing with Donald Trump as president?
Now that I'm not quite sure,
Okay.
but I can say that even in my own work, for example, I find that African Americans are more trusting of federal government than state government, and I can imagine that that is possible because of the relationship that especially state governments in the South had with African Americans and being a part of their discrimination experiences. So again, being sensitive to even those political histories becomes important in our analyses as far as how we then test certain measures.
Right. This is one of the things we're going to hope to be able to sort out with the survey that we're collecting here, with the oversampling of, or the large samples of ethnic minorities within the U.S. And asking questions about support for state and local government in particular. So hopefully we'll be able to tease this out.
And might I also say that even size of government differences, that we find that Latinos and blacks are more supportive of a larger size, hence a federal government that has more services offered to people than we do find among whites. So those kind of nuances even have implications for, yet again, partisanship and thinking about partisan sorting. Right. So
maybe with the open-ended data, that will be something we can look for, is to see whether when certain groups are talking about the government, whether they're talking more about services or less about services, which would be interesting to see if that's in there. Elizabeth?
So I think partisan differences are the biggest. I mean, obviously. So I mean, that's the most obvious subgroupings that have differences in trust. I've been intrigued by education and education level. One would think that given how democracy is run, that we would see highly educated people be more supportive of our democratic processes and institutions, just because, you know, heck, they should know more about it and how the whole system is supposed to work, and have, I would say, more realistic expectations about how government works. But we haven't really found much of a difference. In some countries there is a difference. We haven't found much in the US. And that's a bit surprising to me. I would think that that would make a bigger difference. What I do think, as a subgrouping that I think does matter a lot, is that we know that with increased income inequality, we see less trust in government. We see, you know, a lot more negative views about what's going on in the political world. And so I think in the United States, where we have increased income inequality over time, there's just more disgruntlement about how things are working. You know, the rich are rich and the poor are poor, and the middle class is shrinking. And I haven't looked at the data itself, but I would not be surprised at all to see that people who feel that they are really on the short end of the stick are just going to be unhappy about lots of things, including government and how it's run. It's not helping them, right? It's not it's just not there. I also am intrigued by research that shows that people who have direct experiences with specific parts of the government, they love that part of the government, but that doesn't have any impact whatsoever on their overall trust in government. So there's a disconnect between those direct experiences that a person has with any number of government agencies and their own feelings of trust. So it's not. Anyway, so I don't see that as kind of explaining a subgroup that's having an impact on trust.
Mark?
Well, one of the things that I think is, you know, of course, the biggest game in town, as Elizabeth made reference to, is the partisan differences. I mean, they're incredibly deep and incredibly wide, and they have been, you know, for a while now, since at least the end of the Bush years. The thing that I think is so interesting as it relates to the present moment in time is, you know, the study that you made reference to, the Diamond study, Josh, also showed that, at least as it relates to the rules of the game as it relates to politics, as it relates to government institutions, Republicans are on a couple of those things expressing less enthusiasm about, say, the institution of Congress and whether a strong leader ought to be able to bypass, institutions like that. And if, one of my graduate students asked this battery of questions last year, things that, for Americans, you think this is crazy, that people would be okay with institutions other than democracy, they'd be okay with military rule, that they'd be okay with bypassing Congress and the courts for certain things. Fact is, the percentage of Republicans who are willing to do that now has been creeping up over the course of the first year of the Trump administration. And the odd thing about that is, I bet you if you ask those same people the trust in government questions, they would express a lot of trust in government because the government is Donald Trump right now. And he's the type of leader who would be interested in maybe bypassing, some of those types of things. And what I think this points to is the really important need to disaggregate all of these different pieces. Are we talking about the rules of the game? Are we talking about the institutions? Are we talking about the president and so forth? Because it seems to me leading to very different answers. And ones that are potentially problematic. And I grew up actually in a political family here in Washington. My father was press secretary for a Republican Senator Hugh Scott. And I'm terrified, by this moment in time. I mean, I am Mr. Institution, and my proneness for panic about such things is pretty low. I've been studying trust in government for a long time, but we're at a watershed moment, about the actual business of politics. And it's not that, and I think part of it is that this trust in government has been low. And as David Easton said a long time ago, if over the long haul you have low levels of trust, it's corrosive over a period of years. And I think that maybe we are running into that. The Trump candidacy itself is a indication of exactly that.
So I want to push you on this thing, the question you just said here about, or the answer you gave where you said, your students were shocked. How could these attitudes be here in America?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so as
I
someone
was
who
shocked
studies,
too.
Well, as someone who studies comparative politics, like one
Yeah.
of the things that has, one of the sort of insights or the ways that I thought about what was going on in the country last year was that when we look across European democracies, like European democracies with really sort of progressive social democratic systems, your Swedens, your Finlands, right, the Denmark's parts of the world, these parts of the world you have routinely seen, especially in the aftermath of the Great Recession, but even going back in time, that these parties pushing these kind of far-right platforms can get the support of 5%, 10%, in certain circumstances, 15, 20% of the vote. And I've often thought, and I thought last year when a lot of people were expressing sort of shock that people in the United States were responding to some of these types of positions, that the US two-party system has essentially masked this, right? That in a healthy, functioning democracy, it's not unusual to have 10, 15, 20% of the population who's willing to entertain these kind of anti-democratic thoughts, and not only entertain them, but vote for candidates that will push these kind of policy platforms. But that in the United States, we barely see this because the two-party system normally makes it so that you don't end up getting that candidate in your parliament, making speeches, having representation. So on this question, and occasionally we get glimpses of it, right? David Duke gets, becomes a finalist for a Senate seat in Louisiana, but then we forget about it. And it's the party system was masking the fact that these kind of attitudes are not entirely surprising to be present, to go back and think. So what I really want to just get a sense of here is and there's two arguments here. One is the long-term sort of corrosiveness that, yes, it's been there all along, but there's a cumulative effect of it having been there for a long time. The other is that it's actually increasing, substantially right now. So just to throw that back in your court a little bit more, where do your concern right now, as someone who spent a long time of your career studying this, that you're concerned in this moment, is it the long-term corrosiveness, or is it that you think there's an increasing levels here?
Josh, I would like to take this opportunity to plug my new book.
We did not plan this ahead of time, but go ahead.
I appreciate it, though. So my co-author Jonathan and Weiler have a new book that'll be out in the fall called Prius or Pickup, 4 questions that explain America's Great Divide. And basically the idea that, and we show this notion, this worldview, that divides the parties these days. And the 4 questions are these questions about parenting, raising children. What characteristics do you want your kids to have? They are central to understanding people's willingness to go along with these types of parties. And we show that the relationship that the same types of people who brought us Donald Trump are the same types of people who are voting for the AfD in Germany, the same types of people who vote for National Front in France, the same group of people who voted for Brexit in Britain. It's all the same type of a thing. Is it greater? I don't think so. I think Larry Bartels has this terrific piece on this right-wing populism in Europe, and I think it fits here. The fact of the matter is levels of unhappiness as it relates to race, as it relates to ethnicity, immigration, they're incredibly high in the United States. The level of racial resentment is off the charts. Anti-immigrant sentiment is extraordinarily high. The people in this room, we're the outliers. The middle of the distribution of outlook or worldview or whatever is anti those things. And what skillful leaders like Donald Trump or Geert Wilders or whomever, they're tapping into that. So what Larry refers to it as is they're tapping into a reservoir. It's not a wave. We'd like to think of it as a wave because a wave's going to crash at some point. But instead, it's worse. It's a reservoir. Those attitudes exist. They're widespread. There's been concern in Europe about tapping into those things because of the history of anti-Semitism in World War II. But now that the other is not Jewish, but instead African or Muslim, it's okay. And so these welfare states that you were talking about, these places that used to have really high trust in government, like Denmark and Finland and Sweden, they don't anymore. You know why? Because they don't want the services to go to the other. They're fine taking care of Swedes and Danes, but they're not so fine taking care of other people.
Hence the zero sum.
Right.
Yeah, there you go. That's exactly right. That's exactly, it's perfect.
And democracy lets these people have a voice. And if you don't want them to have a voice, you have to shut down democracy.
When you say these people, you mean the right wing?
No. If immigrants are coming in, if people of color are coming in, and you don't want them to have a voice, democracy gives them a voice.
Gives them a chance,
so then you have to shut down aspects of democracy.
So before we open the conversation up to the audience, I want to give our panelists one more sort of general question to address, and then we'll turn and take questions from the audience. What do you think, each of you think at this point, is the biggest unanswered question about trust in institutions? So you've given us a lot of points that you think are salient, a lot of points that you think are driving these trends. What do you think, what do we not know enough about right now that we should know, that what we really want to know about? So maybe we'll go reverse order this time.
Okay, so the one thing that really occurs to me is, this idea of drilling down more deeply into what parts of government, how people are evaluating, these different, say cabinet agencies or, whatever they might be. Do people have enough information about them to actually provide anything other than a non-attitude? So I made reference to Health and Human Services. Well, if people don't know what Health and Human Services is, what's the point of asking them about it? You're just going to get a lot of noise. Right. How do we get around that problem? I don't know the answer to it. Tom and I tried, to provide people with more information about, things. It didn't seem to make much of a difference, in that regard. So one of the things that I wonder, is possible, can we study these component parts of government in an environment where we know people have low levels of information about them?
Which is interesting to contrast with Elizabeth's point before and some of what we were studying, which is that we're in this environment, right, where ostensibly we should have much more information. Yeah. But is there a kind of curvilinear relationship? You give people a little more information, they know a little bit more. You give them nonstop information from everybody, and it becomes impossible to sort of process and disentangle some of this
and there has to be a motivation for people to listen to it. It may be that we all have motivation, to listen to it, but 95% of the public, like, who cares?
Elizabeth?
So I think that people are a lot more conflicted about their attitudes about both democracy and about our institutions. And I don't think we've tapped into that conflicting ideas, inconsistent ideas that people might have. So this recent article that Steve Nicholson co-authored looking at implicit trust versus explicit trust, I found fascinating. Because I really do think that there's something, I do think that a lot of people, if you ask them, would you prefer democracy over other forms of government, they're going to say democracy, right? Because we're trained, we're socialized into this from a young age. So I would be intrigued at trying to figure out, trying to parse out these different attitudes people have to try to make better sense of how it all fits together into what we're seeing now. And related to the Trump vote, I do think that it's and also right-wing leaders, nationalist leaders in Europe, I'm curious about how people think about that and how it relates to democracy and what they're thinking about how this furthers democracy. The whole attempts to try to decrease voter turnout, how does that fit? How do we think about that in the United States? And so I think there are a lot of conflicting ideas people have, and I would like to get better at what they're thinking.
For me, I think it would be a matter of getting a better handle of our behavioral analyses. So in other words, what it means for us to consider both qualitative and quantitative approaches to conceptualizing our measures. So how we can go into the field and actually ask people, taking that time, might I add, and resources to ask people what they're thinking about with respect to trust and being more specific with our questions. So no, we may not be able to ask how much do you trust in Congress, but we might ask how much do you trust in Congress to do such and such, to pursue this interest or what have you. So our specificities might help us gauge more accurately what people are thinking. But then, of course, what that means for us then in placing that in a survey is yet another thing. And so I'll add to that, what would be important is I think we really have to get a handle of our measures on race and racial attitudes. Because at least from what I'm seeing with various questions that I'm culling in various surveys, they have implications for race because there are policy issues that have been racialized over time, for example, that are suggesting that whites and non-whites are thinking differently. And what that means for how we're able to ask questions to tap into what exactly that means, I think we need to consider more.
And are there specific, when you talk about drilling down on some of these things and the kinds of things we can learn, about like asking about, well, not just Congress, but Congress in this, are there specific areas that you think are particularly important that are understudied at this point about, different institutions and different aspects of those institutions? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but just like to draw that out just a little bit more. So if you think that asking these more specific questions, like what are we missing now by not having asked those questions, say on the the general time series, on the general social survey or something like that?
Well, to start, I think we lose out on that longitudinal analysis, right? So over time, how we can see these attitudes have changed. But also, I'm thinking perhaps the size of government question. Mm-hmm. So what does that mean when you see that these groups are thinking about the size of government differently? How is it that we can probe people to ask them more specifically what they have in mind as far as the size of government? I'm trying to think of another question. Oh, one that really stood out for me was that we see a difference in the definition of success for American government, that whites are more likely to express that success exists because of principles of government, whereas we see that Latinos and blacks are more likely to suggest that it is because of changes in government. So that juxtaposition of those points of view, and what actually, if we were to think a little bit more about it historically, really do have meaning as far as these groups' political histories in the United States. Clearly, there's something else to tap into as far as what we can potentially ask these groups about what they mean for the successes of the nation.
Okay.
If I could add to that too, One of the things that I think could be really useful is, if we have problems that need to be solved, could some of these data be, provide a recommending quality to policymakers? So we know that if you frame a policy change in terms of government, people are going to hate it. But what if we framed it in terms of, this agency is going to take care of it? Health and Human Services, it's not a government-run program, it's a Health and Human Services-run program. Maybe then that becomes a political football, I don't know, probably so. But I think, because, as Tom and I, found in our work, people's levels of trust in government is not the mean or of all of their evaluations of the component parts of government. In fact, it's lower than all of them, in that sense. So with that in mind, I think that's really, really important. And this gets, I think, actually at your open-ended approach to this. It's not the institutions, it's not the agencies, it's not the departments, it's not any of these things. What is it? We just don't know.
Right. Okay, so on that cheery note, I would like to open it up to the audience for questions. So if you could, when you ask your question, if you could state your name, and then you can direct it to the panelists. So, all right, let's go.
Ah.
I have two questions, which is...
Oh, sorry, yeah, we need mics.
Yeah, one is equifinality. So you've seen the low levels of trust in France, and so in the US. And so when I think of France, I think it is a case of depolarization, when the two parties have converged so much that it's a big blurb. And so you don't know who to vote for. So Marine Le Pen ends up being way more convincing. And Mark just gave the story of, it's polarization that's driving this. So is it two different tracks for the same outcome? And then my second question is about ideology. And that's a problem because Simpson had two treatments at the same time. Marine Le Pen won, both after the Great Recession, but also because she changed the ideological platform and she tapped into an economic story, an economic resentment that was not part of the far right. To some extent, I think Trump also tapped into. Mm-hmm. So what's the role of the supply side, in explaining these dynamics?
I can take a stab at it. As a non-expert on France, let me throw myself at it. My understanding, at least, is certainly the case in the United States, and I suspect that it may be the case in France. There are moments in time when these types of messages are likely to resonate more. It's hard to make a right-wing populist case when everybody's happy. The attitudes are there, but even the craftiest candidates are going to have a hard time. So, in the wake of, say, the refugee crisis or, an economic downturn, that the timing is right on. But I think what, at least in the U.S., the consensus among political scientists is this notion of economic unease, this economic anxiety is crazy. There's no evidence, that that's actually the case. It seems to be about race. It seems to be about ethnicity. It seems to be about concern about the other. I don't know whether that would be the case in France. Obviously, the voting system is different. I don't know how it would find force there in this way. But what does seem to be the case is that the Le Pen voters were making decisions based on their overall worldview as opposed to their economic anxieties. My sense is what the economic anxiety does is, gives people a fig leaf to hide behind because they'd really rather not view themselves as being anti-other.
Yeah, go ahead.
So for me, I'm going to approach this perhaps from a historical lens and using the United States, in that probably the United States was depolarized because there were the same perspectives of exclusion for many of these groups, right? But now we have a party system such that one party increasingly shows an expression of inclusion, whereas the other now is moving in the opposite direction, hence the polarization. So I think in some ways there is some operation in tandem. It's just a different moment in political history and what that means.
Yeah, it's interesting, your explanation here. I have supervising a PhD student who's at Columbia, a woman named Maria Snegovia, and she's looking at this in Hungary, and is making a similar argument in the Hungarian case that you have this migration of the left-wing party towards the center, and that what that does is it opens up what used to be sort of left-wing voters are getting picked off by a sort of far right-wing party with a kind of populist economic message. And so this story of what's happening with Le Pen, so there is an interesting question about, and that then leads into the sort of, going back to your sort of long-term effects. You can talk about long-term effects of decline in trust, but long-term effects of some of these grand alliances in the middle where the center left and center right start to look like each other. And I think that's a very important research question to see whether traditional left-wing voters are being picked off, which is similar, coming back to the US, where you talk about sort of union workers being picked off in the Midwest by Trump and sort of flitting around, to the other side of this. So I think there are interesting parallels there. Okay, yes, next. Mike, right next to you.
Joel Cooper-Smith, I'm here at Georgetown. You've spent most of the time on government institutions, but I wonder whether you think that the decline in private institutions in this country has had a great impact on this, the sort of bowling alone concept, both in terms of giving individuals identity and also broader political representation at times through these organizations.
And I just want to make sure that I heard, you said private institutions, with what respect? I'm sorry, I had trouble hearing.
Do you mean declining trust in non-government institutions, or do you mean more like a Putnam less?
What I'm asking is, does the decline in non-government institutions create further decline in government because of loss of identity of individuals and the fact that some of these organizations, like unions and others, represent them in a broader way and they no longer have that representation?
One thing that I think is really interesting, the trends in the GSS data over time are really stark, especially over the last 15 or so years when it relates to scientific experts, religion, and business. They've just been, just nosediving along with, well, actually more rapidly than government, in that sense. I could just speak to one of those, and that is religious institutions. I think that the impact of that is, a politicization of people who do identify with religion. They feel like their identities are under attack, by the rest of the country. And I don't think that there's any doubt that that's a source of some of the polarization, that is, taking place in the country these days. And one of the things that makes, political conflict so uncomfortable at this point. I don't know that business or science or these other institutions play that same role, but I think the sense of siege that people who are religious feel, especially those in the evangelical community feel from the outside world, is important.
And I would say that, we know that generalized trust is related to political trust. So there is a relationship between the two, and the less people feel this sense of generalized trust, the less, it's likely that they're going to have less political trust. And I do think that, like, the decline in unions has an impact. People and decline in religious institutions, because people don't have that strong sense of identity with those groups. I do think, though, that kind of the fact that there is declining trust in all sorts of different institutions suggests it's a really bigger, we can't just look at politics for an answer to the decline in trust. And it's not just a US thing, so we have to look more broadly than the United States. It's the decline in trust is a big overarching thing that's happening. And as I said before, I think that income inequality has something to do with it, because I do think this sense of not feeling like you're benefiting from the society, plays a role. But I think there's other things too. I just think, and it could be the decline in social capital, it can be, there's all sorts of different explanations, but it is bigger than just politics.
And I would even offer something that you mentioned earlier, Elizabeth, and that was the significance of scandals. So what that means for revelations of scandals in these different institutions. Of course, it would depend upon testing that relationship, but people's awareness of them and what that means for how they perceive that these institutions are fulfilling what people might think are their purpose, whether or not there's some discrepancy, could possibly lead to distrust as well. So.
I was curious about the notion of a reservoir versus a wave, and how, if Trump represents some kind of crisis of trust in the institutions, and his election does, and if we look at the threshold there as his nomination rather than his election, with kind of the strength of partisanship, basically. How would the overall broad crisis of trust in institutions mix with a more or less static reservoir, and maybe something in the parties, maybe something in media, maybe something more specific that somehow lets Trump win a nomination, or lets, if it's going to be a longer kind of movement, maybe lets Palin win a vice presidential nomination? What is different that's allowing this reservoir to get the nomination, which then puts it in proximity of the White House?
Well,
how does the party, or not the party, but the general trust fit in there?
I don't mean to start every one of the answers. My sense is what allowed what allowed Trump to win the nomination is, frankly, I don't mean to be overly partisan about this, but it's a series of decisions that Republicans have made for about the last 50 years, to highlight, race, ethnicity, women's rights, LGBT rights, all in a negative way. And it created a coalition of people who are extraordinarily cynical. They're cynical about government. They feel like things are being taken from them and other people are being put in the front of the line, these other groups. Those people used to be split evenly between the parties in the 80s and the 90s. And in fact, I suspect they used to be mostly Democrats in the 40s and the 50s. But as politics came to be about these types of issues, race, gender, crime and punishment, which is highly racialized, those types of things, LGBT rights, and then add to it how to deal with terrorism. It created a coalition in the Republican Party where this went from being a relatively small group of people to being one that was large enough that in a crowded field of 15 candidates that they could provide the nomination, or at least the movement towards Donald Trump at the beginning of the process. You think about how he started his candidacy. They're sending rapists. This is no joke. That tapped into something. You didn't see the other Republican candidates pushing back and saying, no, they're not. In fact, they pushed for more restrictions as it related to immigration too. They knew what the party was, and that's fine for the party if the establishment still has control of them. So if Romney is still going to get the nomination, well, these folks will vote for us. If McCain gets the nomination, these folks will vote for us. But now they're running the show. The sort of Pat Buchanan, Sarah Palin, Donald Trump part of the party, they run it.
And if I can also add that I think those attitudes that were more or less massaged also were coupled with the notion of a maverick, right? And so who would be that person who could carry that message in a way that they do not care about the repercussions? And so with timing, with the attitudes that were ripe to be coaxed, here we are in this moment where we have found that person that brought that to the party's fore.
And I would add to that the Republicans have for a long time been running against government, and that people shouldn't trust government, and therefore having one candidate who is absolutely not government be the one who wins the nomination is, to me, hardly surprising. So if you're going to just really foment not only a lot of the racial stuff and this kind of notion that the maverick is great, but you also foment this idea that people shouldn't trust government, government is bad, government is evil, and then you are going to go elect somebody, you're going to try to pick somebody who doesn't represent that evil, right? You're going to pick somebody who's outside of the government. And when I don't think Democrats are necessarily immune to this. I mean, when people started talking about Oprah Winfrey being the next presidential candidate for the Democrats, I just screamed inside. It's like, no, it actually takes some skill to be a good leader in our government. You can't just be able to run a talk show of whatever type or some television reality show and be a good president. And so I think this fomenting of distrust in government that we've seen a lot is really eating at the heart of having, we elect people who are not good.
Let me just to add, just to make clear that both Shayla and Beth are exactly right about this. I mean, we've had like Tom Tancredo in the past. They didn't go anywhere. It's the skill and the outsiderness of Donald Trump that seems to be like the X factor, in this regard.
Yeah, and I would also I would caution a little bit about, I think we have a tendency when things happen to look back and say, well, that was definitely going to happen. I mean, that election was a statistical tie. I mean, you run that election 100 times, maybe Trump wins 60 times and Clinton wins 40 times. Had Clinton won that election, we would be talking about how this was a toxic cancer for the Republican Party. Yes. They were the first time to have lost 3 terms in a row. We'd be invoking Tom Tancredo. There was a whole narrative set to say that this was the end. And you were listening. I mean, I sat with Republican campaign consultants after 2012, and they knew what the party had to do to remain relevant in a world where the white proportion of the population was declining, and that was the Republican Party had to make outreach to Latinos and stress small government, conservatism, Catholicism, these kinds of things. The dream candidate was Marco Rubio. That was going to turn the ship around. And you can just imagine the narrative, we picked the absolute opposite candidate to do that. The party lost an election it should have won. There's a massive cleansing of the party going on right now, right? And this is all based on a statistical coin flip, right? Now we can ask why the election was that close. So I just there were some idiosyncrasies around that election. And I think the 16 candidates running for election, going back to my earlier point, that we can look across Europe and we can see these kinds of candidates routinely getting 15% of the vote, and whether it's racial resentment versus economic discontent, these things are happening in the aftermath of this severe economic dislocation that took place 10 years ago, right? And they're happening not just in the United States. I mean, you could ask a thought experiment of what happens if Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio make a deal beforehand and one of them runs and the other one doesn't run, and Chris Christie decides to take out some other candidate besides Rubio at that debate, and you just spin this thing a little differently. So I do think we have to I think the reservoir thing is absolutely correct. And that's why I've been pushing the panelists a bit. And one of the things I'm very interested in learning on this project over the longer term is whether this is a thing that's increasing over time. Obviously, we know there's a lot of elite queuing that goes on. And so one of the big questions is now that moment in time, that fulcrum, if we hadn't had this situation where the Republican Party, and let's call this what it was, the Republican Party got stuck with the candidate they did not want, right? That was the least, and it was just sort of a crazy moment that at the end, the Republican Party leadership was trying to decide between Ted Cruz, who they also didn't want, and Trump, and that this was a situation. And so it's an interesting, I don't know, so there's a lot of interesting things about what happened. Now, what happens now that we're living under this is another question, and whether this story that we're now telling about how the Republican Party was inevitably going to get to this point will now be true because the leadership of the Republican Party is at this point and is around Trump is I think an open question. So not to overstay this.
And they could have had John Kasich, who looks vaguely like me, so that could have been huge.
Right. Okay, we've got many more questions here in the audience. Yes.
Chris White, I'm a student here at Georgetown. Jonathan, you mentioned, and I know you're not on the panel, but I'll direct the question to Joshua, your partner in research. You mentioned that you were interested in doing oversampling of racial minorities as part of the Baker poll. I'm wondering to what extent you guys are incorporating the perspectives of some of your colleagues of color in terms of calibrating the questions that might not occur to you if the targeted people you're polling don't share aspects of their identity with you.
That's I don't know if my lavalier is on. Oh, it's on. Okay, great. That's a great question. One of the things throughout the whole process, we want to bring in a wide variety of voices and suggestions, and that's one of the reasons we wanted to start with, and before we went into the field, have a convening like this, and also as we move forward. I think we want to, every time we do an iteration, if we do iterations of this, we want to consult widely and get suggestions widely. I think another thing we want to do is we acknowledge that none of us kind of know what people are thinking. And so the open-endeds, I hope, will acknowledge that we don't, we're getting it wrong maybe, we were not understanding a wide variety of American communities the way we should. But I think that's essential, and I think it has been a weakness of some of the polling that I've used and that other people have used, is that we haven't drawn on suggestions of experts in communities of color to write the questions when we do closed-ended questions. And I think it's essential that we do that and do more reaching out and more convenings to do that.
Yeah, just like a cultural competence advisory panel.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
I mean, I think a part of our hope here is that by the combination of the open-ended questions and the oversampling of groups, so we can actually have large enough samples to make inferences about the subpopulations in the survey, that will enable sort of people who are interested in this to think about asking questions that they haven't asked before in this regard, and then people will be able to get that information out of this. And that's part of the idea about trying to make the data accessible and open for people to analyze. But it's a great point. Yes?
Thank you. Can you hear me? Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. My name is Lorelei Kelly. I'm at the Beck Center for Social Impact and Innovation here at Georgetown. I'm going to be a devil's advocate a little bit in terms of institutions and the trust deficit. I work directly with members of Congress and their staff in districts, so talking to district-facing staff about who they trust for policy information. And one of the things that is obvious in all of the discussions I've had is that the people inside the institution have lots of reasons to not trust the public. A lot of it is because the information tsunami that's coming at them all the time, antiquated methods of sorting and filtering, to things like any extra money they get, and this is true this year, didn't go to capacity or expertise, it went to bulletproof vests. They get shot at. We've sort of destroyed every possibility of thoughtful deliberation in public and also inside Congress itself. I mean, look at the legislation over the last 6 months. I feel like that it's not fair to make this a one-way problem unless we also address the fact that we have a whole technology industry that built a connection platform on an advertising model and has basically strip-mined civics. So it's not only monetized, it's weaponized. Do you get what I'm saying? It's like there's got to be a way to have some more empathy for the institution itself in this trust deficit, because there are real reasons why people in elected office don't trust what's coming at them, and what it's doing is just causing this circling the wagons phenomenon. But every single congressional staff I talk to has something, it's called a gut check, basically. Who's talking to you? How do they know you? Where do they come from? And then it becomes a question of, are we broadening the aperture of access to the conversation? And that is happening. It is happening in really interesting, unusual ways, but it's not going to happen in DC. It's going to be decentralized. That's where the trust exists, and it's really still in person. So I don't know how you capture that, but I feel like it's really important to look at it as a two-way deficit.
And do you have a specific question?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. My question was, are you seeing any of the sort of wave of civic activism now building a successful connection instead of just sort of protest or, more running against the institutions. I have seen some of that, and so I'm hopeful that this organizing that's happening now will make the parties obsolete, for example, or will create the methods of trust-based community, emergent collaboration, that kind of thing. Do you see any of that happening?
No. And this is the thing. I mean, one of the reasons, and this starts in the wake of the Great Society, and the violence that is there, and then the lack of success of the Carter presidency. Nobody says anything nice about government. I mean, nobody does. There appear to be no incentives for people to say anything positive about it. Bill Clinton tried to, and Democrats need to, right? Because this is the set of institutions that should be, or will be the policy drivers, the makers of policy. Why do we have such low levels of trust? I mean, the foundational theories of public opinion is that, it's going to reflect the balance of things, of considerations that elites provide. If nobody provides any positive considerations about government, nobody's going to think anything positive about government. But it's a very self-fulfilling prophecy, at this point. If when people say something positive about it, they just get shouted down, folks are not going to, say anything positive. And if they're rewarded on the other side of the coin for being negative, then they're going to keep doing that. I don't know how that cycle breaks, other than to figure out some ways to provide people with incentives, to speak on behalf of the positive things that government does. It would be great, if somebody were in a position to stand up and do something along those lines. I think it would make a difference.
But it's also the case that, people in the government say negative things about the government all the time, right? I mean, Dick Fenno's thing, right? They go back home and they trash Congress, and so and people love their own member of Congress. That's gone down, but they still tend to like their own member of Congress much more than they like all the other members of Congress. If they could just vote out the other, 533 people, through 32 people, they'd be happy. But they can't. And so I think, it is, I think Fenno's work is really instructive about how members of Congress do think about their constituents. And as I said before, I think it is a real skill to be a good political leader. And I don't think people necessarily appreciate that. But boy, I sure don't see the demise of parties. I don't see a real rise in activism that is trying to be more open and inclusive and empathetic. I don't see that much at all. I see much more of a rise in this, especially social media attacks, where anything that's said, there's just this just vitriol that's directed at whoever said it. And I also think the way that media tend to cover what's going on in Congress has a corrosive effect, because instead of, there are real differences in policy interests of people, and so the debate in Congress is legitimate. We do have to have real debate, but the media coverage tends to focus on the bickering and dysfunction, and I think that's problematic as well.
I would say I do not quite see the demise of parties being on the immediate horizon, no. But what I do think might be distinctive about this moment is political entrepreneurship. And so what that means for influence as far as people actually running their own candidacies to then represent the interests of people who are in the collective mindset as they are, I think will be different. So we're seeing at least groundwork, and I can only say this anecdotally, but that there are organizations, movements that are attempting to run people as candidates. And as people do see money being perhaps corrosive for politics, I think nonetheless there's an attempt to provide resources for these candidates to challenge the ideas that might be connected to money and politics in the way that we've seen it manifest thus far.
2 points on that. One is, one of the things that we're going to have on the survey is a few questions about political participation. So it's going to be interesting to see. I mean, I do think that this, one of the, each reaction begs a reaction, and there has obviously been, since the election of Trump, a group of people that have gotten involved in the political process, be it through protesting, be it through organization, be it through community organization, be it through running for office, that is higher and for those particular groups of people than had been previously. And so it's going to be interesting to see, we're intrigued to know about whether this experience of participating in politics, what that does to these kinds of trust levels, what that does for support for democracy. I mean, you can have your policy issues where you will, but it seems to me pretty impossible not to be inspired by these Parkland kids who are just sort of like, lighting up a generation of younger people who are seeing what's happened. And we do know that social media makes it easier for people to participate in politics. Now, we can have debates about the extent of that participation, but the fact that, this Parkland story is such an illustration of it, that these high school kids are suddenly having this, big national megaphone, and it's being provided by the media, but in part it's being provided by their ability to organize other people on social media. Social media, we have lots and lots of examples. We can talk about the pernicious effects of it on democracy, but we can also talk about the ability it gives people to organize and solve these kinds of collective action problems. So hopefully one of the things that this study will allow us to do is sort of look and see whether there are relationships between people who are participating in politics and their levels of trust. And we are, I think, in a moment right now when there are different levels of people participating in politics than we had seen previously. And, and I think the same thing happened on the right after the election of Obama and Obamacare, where you saw the rise of these Tea Party organizations, right? So this may be the left's moment in that regard, and it may be a rebalancing out. I will say one thing about parties, though, right? Like, the weakening of parties is what got you Donald Trump as the nominee of the Republican Party, right? So there's a lot of discussion about, and a lot of these issues about money in politics, and the way money in politics is flowing right now is it's flowing to non-party actors, right? So the decline of parties is a very complex issue, and I think there are people who study this in the U.S. context that can illuminate this a lot. But I think it's important to be aware of what's driving that and what are the consequences of that, and what we'll see going forward in elections in that regard. Okay, other question? Yeah.
Bill Gormley from the McCourt School. So one of the pretty consistent findings from the trust polls over many years is that state and local governments enjoy greater trust than the federal government. And one possible explanation for that is that their goods and services are more visible and more tangible. You get to see road crews at work, you get to rub elbows with your child's teacher at school and so forth. But I wonder if there are some other explanations. For example, you mentioned the Stoneman Douglas students who are so inspiring. They've been able to produce change at the state level. In Florida, they may or may not be able to produce change. Arguably, state and local governments are more responsive than the federal government. So what is your view on why the polls over so many years have shown that the public has greater confidence in state and local governments than in the federal government?
So I think one thing that's fascinating is that as state governments started cleaning up their act more, the confidence in them went down. So I do think there's something kind of intriguing about that. I think that we had talked earlier about how the more homogeneous a political unit, the more people tend to like their government, and the less heterogeneous, the less they like it. I think that at the state level, I'm from Nebraska. How homogeneous can you get? And people tend to love their state government. It gives services to people who are part of the community in a kind of a homogeneous way. And I think that when you expand it to the national level, all these people are benefiting. And again, it could be because I live in Nebraska, but the whole idea for Nebraskans that Californians get anything is just appalling. Why would Californians get anything? So there is this kind of, I think the homogeneity of state and local, especially local units, it tends to be more it's homogeneous in a lot of different ways, but part of it is in a political way. So people ideologically tend to be a bit more similar. They tend to share the same, values, and all of that feeds into it.
Oh, so, well, for me, I expressed earlier that when we disaggregate the analyses for trust in federal government versus state and local government, we actually find that, for example, Black Americans are actually more trusting of federal government than state and local government. So I just wish to emphasize this notion of living in a heterogeneous environment versus homogeneous environment really does perhaps make a difference in how we see those two levels of government perceived.
I'll add one last thing to piggyback on Beth's point and to suggest the European counterpart to this. I mean, the more homogenous places, like in Northern Europe, have really high levels of, trust and strong social safety nets, and so the homogeneity piece has to be an important one. Let me also suggest that it may be that people have no idea what state government does. Most of the papers that I've refereed over the years that use trust in state government as a dependent variable, the only thing basically that is statistically significant is how much people trust the federal government, and it has the same word "trust," in it. And what that means, to people who don't do quantitative social sciences, nothing is related to this, or not very much is related to trust in state and local government. And one explanation of that is that people they're answering at random, in a sense. But it's positive because it's not the federal government.
I have to follow up to that. My mic? Oh, thank you. Okay. So is that another instance where white Americans and communities of color are different? So white Americans might not have much of an attitude towards state and local government because they can afford not to.
Right.
But communities of color have an attitude and a fairly skeptical attitude towards state and local government because they feel their livelihood and their bodily integrity is under threat from local government in some often. Right? So I mean, white Americans might have non-attitudes and communities of color may have fairly firm attitudes. I don't know if anyone's...
It may be. I don't know whether that's the case. But one of the things that occurred to me as Shayla and Beth were answering the questions is it might be really interesting actually to look state by state at this, or within different groups of states by levels of homogeneity, levels of racial composition, and things along those lines, because the answer to that question may be different depending upon where.
And I do think to a certain extent the protective aspect of the federal government historically might be a part of just some of that relationship for people of color as far as perhaps distinctions in federal government trust versus state and local trust.
Yeah.
Well, and federal government taking protective action and then state governments trying to undermine those protective actions. I mean, it's pretty clear that experiences at the state government versus federal government was just dramatically different for people of color. Yeah.
Although now we might see that that has changed.
Yeah, but it's dramatic. In Tennessee, one of the big stories last week was a young woman from Memphis was recognized for some bit of heroism. I can't remember exactly what it was. But then legislators in Tennessee got the win that she was part of the Black Lives Matter movement, and they sought to take away the award, the recognition. And, that would send a pretty clear message of who's on whose side, as it relates to race and region, so.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Yeah, do you want to go?
Thank you. Keith Early from the School of Continuing Studies. And my question is around polarization and false equivalence. And it kind of is spurred by the notion that there's a two-way deficit, or nobody says anything good about government that was noted. And I'm wondering if there's the equivalent of a political pox on both houses, and whether or not you can look at certain issues, whether it's the Tea Party's response to Barack Obama, or whether it's mass incarceration, or whether it is climate change, and if there is false equivalence on both sides, and if you could speak to that.
So, I mean, I don't know if this quite gets at your question, but what I find fascinating is that people don't really like their own party, but they hate the other party, right? So when we talk about polarization, there's a strong component of affective polarization where, and again, people just don't really love their own party. If you're a Democrat, you don't love the Democrats. If you're a Republican, you don't love the Republicans. But boy, do you hate that other party. And so I think the emotional side of what's driving trust and even what's driving reactions to, like, the science on climate change or the science on whatever, I mean, we can name a lot of things, there's a real emotional reaction to it, and I think feeling of threat is really underlying it all, that we feel very threatened by the idea that the other side might be making decisions on our behalf, and that's scary as all get out.
Yeah. Yeah, the survey data on that is remarkable.
Yeah.
I think it's about 50% of partisans view the other side as a danger to the national interest. You know, according to the Pew studies, it's off the charts relative to how it used to be. One thing that I think this points to that might be useful to think about as we approach the 2018 elections is, you know, that pox on both sides seems to be strongest among the governing party, maybe, you know, in these off-year elections, whether it was 6, 10, 14, and it looks like 18. We're going to see one side, you know, much more motivated. Exactly. And I think Beth's point is a really good one about you know, we don't love our own side, but boy, we sure know about the other, and it ain't good.
But we also see that people are more trusting of their own party when they're in leadership in government too.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
So something that comes to mind as far as the polarization aspect is that, for example, on climate change, while we're seeing increasingly more polarization around that issue, there are other issues that are more polarizing. So even what it means for us to examine specific issues and ones that we really know have been polarizing, and they have, quite honestly, been ones that have been racialized. I think this gets to the heart of, again, a party system that I think is increasingly hearkening some of the implicit racial attitudes that now have become more explicit in our political discourses.
So, having circled back to this issue of polarization and affective polarization, I was wondering if I could get a sort of final word from each of you about the direction of the causal arrows here with our underlying story, right? We're talking about, you know, thinking about trust in institutions, change in trust of institutions. Do you guys think, having thought about this, having looked at this, and we do know, as much as we're like looking at the trust in institutions and asking, you know, what are the trends and things like that, we also know that this affective polarization is at a higher level than it's been previously. And perhaps that has to do with racial sorting of parties, and it has to do with changes that started with Southern Democrats moving to become Republicans. But nevertheless, do you think, going back to Mark's point earlier in the beginning about like the long-term corrosive effect of declining trust in institutions, do you think that the current era of affective polarization is in part a function of long-term declining trust in institutions related to governance in the United States, related to politics? Or do you think it's the other way around, that affective polarization is actually drives the long-term is driving decline in trust in institutions, because when you distrust the other party so much, anything they're touching must be, you know, when you dislike the other party so much, where you don't see them as a legitimate partner in governing, anything they touch must be problematic and it's something to be shunned. Or are these both sort of symptomatic of something else that's underlying in the background? Just we have like, and now you guys have 1 minute each to answer that question. But I just thought we could close on that note.
I think that it is endogenous. So I think they are feeding one another, right? So I think that there are elites that are casting messages, but they're casting messages based on the messages that we find from society, right? And then what that means for how then the two sort through what becomes, I guess, the most ideal package for building candidacies also builds the platforms that feed the parties during elections, if that makes sense.
So I find it interesting that at the time when people feel such affective polarization from the other party, that the institutional structure of our government is actually there to protect from being overwhelmed by the passions of one side. And it's at the same time that people don't trust that government. And so there's nothing to then make people feel better about the whole system and how it works and how they don't have to be that afraid of the other side. So I don't know which comes first, chicken or the egg, but I do think it's ironic that there's nothing there to kind of help people make sense of what's going on.
This is my take, and I'm sticking with it, whether it's right or not. I think that it starts with what you identified, Josh, and that is a party system that's sorted out on different things than it used to be. When we disagreed about how big government ought to be and how much we ought to spend on things, we could compromise. But now that we're divided on things that have to do with sort of cultural and value type differences, that creates a different type of political conflict. But one of the real puzzles, I think, and it's very interesting, is we have come to care so much about something that is politics that most people don't care about. Like, why the heck is that? Like, how are there such strong feelings about something that people, generally speaking, from Converse on forward, don't care about? And I think the thing that's happened is that politics isn't just about politics anymore. The way that we've gotten sorted out sends all of these different messages about who we are, where we live, rural areas versus urban areas, the types of cars we drive, the types of beer we drink. We see, someone with a Duck Dynasty t-shirt, we know what they are. You see someone carrying a yoga mat, you know who they are. We don't even have to talk to them anymore. In other words, the way that we've gotten sorted out, creates the sense that that other side is not like us. We are not like them. Therefore, they're dangerous. And so when they're in charge, we're not going to trust them at all. They were arugula eating, whatever, people, and not like me. So I think whereas this sense of difference drives trust down when the other side is in, it doesn't drive trust up when your side is in.
Exactly.
So I think it goes from issue agenda to this affect to low trust.
Okay. Well, on that note, please join me in thanking the panelists for an incredibly stimulating discussion. So thanks, guys.